So good evening, everyone. And I would like, of course, to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to contribute to this lecture series. And I would also like to thank all of you in the audience for being here during what I know is a very busy week of the semester. And also especially given that my topic lies somewhat outside the conventional scope of Turkish studies. And having said that, I also would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation of the work being done here at the University of Vienna to broaden the scope of what Turkish studies can mean and to build bridges to other scholarly traditions and fields. Now, let me begin by outlining what I will cover today. I will start with a brief introduction to Armenian manuscripts in general, offering also a broad overview of how they have been studied over the past century and a half. I've been told to expect quite a mixed audience, including some who may have little or no previous experience with Armenian manuscript culture. And so I'd like to lay some groundwork and situate what I'm going to say within the larger landscape of Armenian manuscript studies. I was already well familiar with Armenian manuscripts, and I know there's some of you. I ask in advance for your patience. The heart of my talk concerns a fascinating period in Armenian manuscript production, the first half of the 17th century, when Armenian communities were in a profound crisis. Monastic scriptoria were in decline, and yet manuscript production was seemingly on the rise. I will begin with introducing the Armenian 17th century crisis, and then I will turn to microhistory, the life of an Armenian manuscript maker in the Ottoman cities, active in the Ottoman cities of Tokat in Anatolia and Kaffa in Crimea in the first half of the 17th century. His manuscripts and his own words preserved in his colophons, we will see how manuscript production adapted displacement and migration, and how individual scribes sustained Armenian cultural life during a period of a great upheaval. My goal in this talk is twofold. On the one hand, to illuminate a particular moment in the history of Armenian manuscript production, but also more broadly, to offer those unfamiliar with the field a sense of how scholars interested in social histories of Armenian communities approach manuscript heritage. The study of pre-modern Armenian history before the 18th or 19th century is, to a huge extent, a manuscript-centered field. It would be difficult to find an historian of Armenian communities of this period who hasn't worked with manuscripts at one point or another. There are two reasons for this. First, manuscripts remained central to Armenian social and religious life throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, well into the age of print. Second, and perhaps more importantly, given the near total erasure of material traces of Armenian presence across much of the former Ottoman lands and in places like Nakhchivan, manuscripts often provide the only access to those communities and their histories. So given the scale of destruction inflicted on Ottoman Armenian communities during the massacres in the late 19th century and the Armenian genocide and its aftermath, when probably tens of thousands of manuscripts perished, it is quite remarkable that over 30,000 Armenian manuscripts have survived. The largest collection is now preserved in Armenia, the Mesrop Mashtot's Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, also known as the Matan Adaran, followed by the libraries of the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, the Mekhitarist monasteries in Venice and here in Vienna, as well as numerous other collections worldwide. Most manuscripts are dated through colophons, and I'll say a little bit more about colophons in a minute. The earliest surviving manuscripts date to the 9th century, though new discoveries may now push this to an earlier period, and numbers remain quite low before the 12th century. Then there's a real expansion in the 13th century, but the vast majority of surviving manuscripts actually date from the period after 1600. Given the centrality of manuscripts to Armenian history, it's no surprise that there's a long and rich tradition of Armenian manuscript studies. While it is impossible to do justice to this tradition in just one slide, I will try here to highlight a few main directions in the scholarship. So first, of course, comes the Armenian manuscript cataloging tradition, pioneered in the 19th century by the Mephisterist monks in Venice and Vienna. And on my slide, you see the title page of the Vienna collection catalog prepared by Jacobos Dashian, a great Armenian Armenologist and graduate of this very university. Dashian set an extraordinary high cataloging standard that was then followed by others. So he offered detailed physical descriptions, information on script and illuminations, full contents and complete full description of contents and complete reproductions of colophons and marginal notes. These catalogs remain invaluable for historians today, and my own work, in fact, depends very heavily on them. Related project has been the publication of colophons themselves, and one of the most distinctive features of Armenian manuscripts, as many of you will know, are their colophons. Sometimes so long in detail that they have been regarded as mini chronicles in their own right. The most notable initiative to publish the colophons was an 8-volume publication undertaken in Soviet Armenia in the second half of the 20th century, and that's the image on the slide. Codicology, of course, has also been an important part of Armenian manuscript studies, although it has been perhaps developed a little slower than in studies of other manuscript traditions, because so many of Armenian manuscripts are dated and codicology played a lesser role in dating. But as in other manuscript traditions, codicology is now being revolutionized by new technological developments, especially those that enable non-invasive studies of palimpsest manuscripts. And the image that I'm showing on my slide is, it's thought to be a 7th or 8th century Armenian manuscript with a Syriac text written over it, a very important discovery made by a team of scholars working on early Caucasus at the University of Hamburg. Because for much of their history, Armenian manuscripts were produced at monastic scriptoria, often associated with particular visual styles, there is an important direction in the studies of Armenian manuscripts that has focused on histories of particular scriptoria, surveying large bodies of manuscripts attributable to them. I'm including here as an illustration a recently published volume on monastic scriptoria of the historical Armenian provinces of Artsakh and Utik. Many Armenian manuscripts feature illuminations. They're well known, celebrated for their richness and diversity of their visual styles. And the history of Armenian art has long focused on manuscript painting, and it remains a vibrant and well-established field today. But here I would like to note that in recent years, there's also a new direction closely related to the art historical field that has emerged, namely scholars examining questions of provenance and modern lives of manuscripts, bringing a critical heritage perspective to Armenian manuscript studies. And a notable example of this is Hegnar Vodenbo's The Missing Pages, the modern life of medieval manuscript from genocide to justice that I'm showing on the slide. Finally, there is a social history approach, which my talk relates most directly. Studying manuscripts as objects embedded in social practices, examining how manuscript production both reflected and contributed to social transformations within Armenian communities. The example I'm showing on the slide is Erin Pignon's recent doctoral dissertation and now a book in the making on a particular type of Armenian manuscript in the context of confessionalization and the rise of printing in the early modern Ottoman Empire. I'm concluding this brief overview. I should underline that these are very schematic categories, and apart from the very technical works like catalogs, most studies of manuscripts exist somewhere at the intersection of these categories, often covering more than one. Now, it would be impossible to speak of Armenian manuscripts without mentioning the name of Tigran Kuyumjan, Professor Emeritus of Armenian Studies at California State University, Fresno. Kuyumjan has made his contributions to the field, including pioneering a quantitative approach and tracing long durée patterns in manuscript production based on large data sets. And I want to focus here on his one particularly important article titled Dated Armenian Manuscripts as a Statistical Tool for Armenian History, published in 1984. In this article, Kuyumjan presented the results of his study mapping the production of thousands of dated Armenian manuscripts across several centuries, decade by decade. Study allowed Kuyumjan to make two crucial observations. First, Armenian manuscript production decreased dramatically after 1500. I think you can see this that he was talking about, hitting its lowest point in the first decades of the 16th century. Kuyumjan connected this decline to the destruction and abandonment of Armenian monastic Scriptoria in the Armenian highlands due to the violence of the Ottoman Safavid warfare. Second, he observed a dramatic increase in the manuscript production beginning in the second half of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century. So this is the reversal. Kuyumjan attributed to the rise of what he called the new dynamic mercantile middle class, a development that heralded the beginning of Armenian modernity. The early 17th century was hardly a time of calm and prosperity for Armenian communities. Indeed, the beginning of Armenian early modernity is associated with two great upheavals. The Jalali revolts, which shook the Ottoman Empire in the final decade of the 16th century and the first decade of the 17th, rooting tens or perhaps hundreds of thousands of Armenians from their historic homelands in Anatolia and the Caucasus. The forced deportation of Armenians from the Ottoman Safavid borderlands by Shah Abbas I in 1604-1605. Upheavals fundamentally reshaped Armenian geography. Communities that had been concentrated around the Armenian plateau and central Anatolian cities like Sivas and Kayseri dispersed westward to Western Anatolia, the Mediterranean, Eastern and Southeast Europe, and eastward to Isfahan and eventually to the Indian Ocean. The rise of the Armenian diaspora in the wake of these migrations and diasporic cultural renaissance that followed are the subject of two very important recent books, likely familiar to many here. Henry Shapiro's The Rise of Western Armenian Diaspora in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire, and Sabu Aslanyan's Early Modernity and Mobility. Armenian manuscript production was thus flourishing amidst the profound refugee crisis. What was driving this flourishing? Who was copying the manuscripts and where? What kinds of manuscripts were being made and for whom? So these questions bring me now and my case study. I came to the topic of 17th century Armenian manuscripts, not at all as a manuscript scholar, and indeed not even as an Armenologist. What brought me to it was rather a regional interest. I just completed a doctoral dissertation on the medieval history of the area around Tokat, a city in the southern Black Sea region of Anatolia, also known as Inner Pontus. I became interested in the history of Tokat's Armenian community, which, probably medieval in origin, grew to comprise nearly half of the city's population by the 15th century. Browsing manuscript catalogs, I came across many manuscripts from Tokat, and those copied by scribes from Tokat, mostly from the 17th century, mostly quite ordinary works with no special artistic value. So I became interested in the people and social settings behind these manuscripts, and this is how the study began. And this is also probably the right place to acknowledge the DFG program Trans-Ottomanica and the University of Essen that provided funding and institutional support during this research, as well as DR's editorial team who saw the resulting article through the program. As with any research, one needs a bit of luck, and I had mine. Most colophons preserve very limited information about scribes, and most scribes' work survives in only one or two manuscripts. Only a handful of 17th century scribes have more than 10 manuscripts attributed to them. One among this handful turned out to be from Tokat, Stepanos of Tokat, or Stepanos Tokateci, a priest, poet, and manuscript copyist active in the late 16th and early 17th century. There's more luck. The colophons of the 16 surviving manuscripts he copied or cleared, together with his poems, amounted really to a kind of autobiography narrated by the scribe himself. Finally, I had even more luck because his trajectory turned out to be really quintessential early 17th century Armenian life. There was dispossession, forced migration, revival in the refugee community, and something very touching and perhaps quite unusual, there was a return home, not just to Tokat, but to his own neighborhood. Stepanos was born in Tokat in 1558 and lived in the neighborhood of Mihmad Hajib near the Church of the Holy Martyrs, one of the Tokat's largest Armenian churches. Married at 19, became a priest at 22, taking over the leadership of the Church of the Holy Martyrs. In 1589, he went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and the first evidence of his work as a book preparer, copyist, dates back to the 80s and 15. Stepanos was in Tokat in 1602 when the city was captured by the Jelalis. The attackers ravaged and burned the city, massacring part of the population and putting the rest to flight. Stepanos himself was captured and beaten, and surviving only because he was mistaken for dead. With few companions, he fled first to Constantinople and then to Kaffa in Crimea, which was home to a large and prosperous Armenian community. From 1603 to 1621, he lived in Kaffa, where very quickly he rebuilt his status and resumed his manuscript-making trade. From 1605 onwards, he served as the priest of Kaffa's Church of St. Gregory the Illuminator and had his own congregation. After 19 years in exile, in 1621, he returned to Tokat. The last evidence of his work as a scribe comes from 1622, and it's thought that he died soon after. Tracing Stepanos' life and his modest manuscript-making enterprise, we can glimpse how Armenian manuscript production survived, and indeed even flourished, during a time of crisis and dispersal, persisting when monastic Scriptoria waned or could no longer meet the needs of new migrant communities. But before discussing his career as a manuscript maker, I would like to say a few words about Armenian Tokat, or Tokhat, as it was known in Armenian, and its place in the geography of Armenian manuscript production. 16th century Tokat, where Stepanos was born, where he learned his trade, was one of the most important Armenian settlements in Anatolia. Armenian communities had existed in and around Tokat since the medieval period, but the city only emerged as a recognizable center of Armenian culture from the late 15th and especially from the 16th century onward. This is very well reflected in the growing number of people who identified themselves as Tokatsi or Yevdokatsi, meaning of or from Tokat. What drove the rise of Armenian Tokat? Probably geography and trade. Like traditional centers of Armenian learning further east in the Ottoman Safavid frontier zone, Tokat's location in central Anatolia spared it from the worst ravages of inter-imperial warfare. Yet, unlike cities in Western Anatolia that had little or no Armenian population prior to the great 17th century migration, Tokat seems to have been already an important Armenian settlement in the 15th century. The first Ottoman, as I mentioned before, we know from the first Ottoman tax register. The city dated to 1455. You can see it on the slide. Armenians made up nearly half of the city's population, spread across 6 neighborhoods. Tokat served as an episcopal see with 8 Armenian churches in the city itself. There were several monasteries and churches in nearby villages. It was also a center of textile manufacturing and a bustling commercial hub at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Aleppo, Tabriz, the Black Sea ports, and Constantinople. Stepanos himself, in his lament written after the destruction of the city at the hands of Jelalis, paints a vivid picture of an affluent city filled with busy markets, textile shops, inns, public baths, and magnificent merchant houses. Was Tokat also a center of manuscript production? No and yes. Tokat lay very much on the margins of the traditional geography of Armenian manuscript production. One never hears of Tokat masterpieces or Tokat school of manuscript illumination, and there's no evidence of monastic Scriptoria operating in or around Tokat, either before or after the Jelali attack. Manuscripts were being produced there, and in his poems, Stepanos praises Tokat's many learned men, both clergy and laity, suggesting that there was both demand and resources for manuscripts among the city's Armenians. It seems that Stepanos was born into an environment where manuscripts were produced by individual mobile copyists who carried out all the artisanal work themselves and negotiated their own commissions. Evidence for this world in the 16th century is very thin. Only a dozen manuscripts produced in the city before the 1602 Jalali attack are known to survive, and much was likely lost when churches and homes were burned and books destroyed, as Stepanos notes in his lament. But from the 17th century onward, the picture becomes much clearer, as the story of Stepanos himself demonstrates. So how did one become a scribe in this kind of environment? Working without Scriptoria, independent manuscript makers like Stepanos had to master a wide range of tasks, otherwise handled by teams of specialized professionals. Though Stepanos called himself a scribe, he did much more than just writing. His tasks included sizing and burnishing paper, preparing inks and writing implements, folding quires, laying out pages, and binding. Such applied knowledge must have been passed mainly through master-apprentice chains. He mentions several apprentices in his colophons, and indeed the last manuscript that Stepanos is known to have produced in 1622 was for his apprentice Hovsepp, a perfect parting gift from an aging master. It contained detailed instructions for preparing various inks and paints, starching paper, and fixing scribal mistakes, as well as a list of 300 common ligatures and abbreviations. Naturally, manuscripts by independent scribes wouldn't match the artistic quality famous Scriptoria, but this hardly mattered. The ordinary manuscripts produced by Stepanos seemed to have been good enough for his patrons. What seems to have mattered most for success wasn't artistic quality of the manuscripts, but social connectedness of their makers, the ability to access source manuscripts and secure commissions. From his birth, Stepanos was well positioned to succeed. Both his parents bore the title Mahdesi, meaning that they had completed pilgrimages to Jerusalem, as had Stepanos himself already as a young man, which was a clear sign of affluence. Family's wealth probably enabled his ecclesiastical education and his appointment as a priest of one of Tokat's largest churches at the age of only 22. But beyond these general indications of affluence, Stepanos left us something much more concrete. In the margins of one of his manuscripts, he recorded an elegy he composed for grieving parents in Kaffa who had lost a young daughter. To console the parents, he juxtaposed Tokat and Kaffa as allegories of earthly life and heaven, and then enumerated his own earthly losses. So he said, your child died, but I also lost the Lord. And what otherwise reads like a rather tactless rhetorical choice turned out to be a gift for the historian, because there we learn that Stepanos abandoned in Tokat 2 well-built stone houses and 2 pavilions, mattresses, rugs and carpets, fine metalware, a water spring, an orchard, a bakery, and a silk weaving workshop. When he fled to Kaffa, he added, out of all of these possessions, he was able to bring only 1,000 dram, which I presume is about 3 kilograms of woven silk, a bit of portable wealth, which he then, as he says, multiplied and enjoyed. This reveals that Stepanos came from a family whose wealth derived at least partly from the silk trade and manufacturing, the same pattern of silk money that sponsored Armenian cultural production in many other places. That Stepanos was connected both to ecclesiastical establishment and the merchant networks of Tokat is not surprising. The church and the marketplace, clergy, and Hojas, as merchants were known in Armenian, were closely related through kinship, friendship, and patronage. Stepanos and his brother Jacob became priests, and Stepanos married the priest's daughter. From his poems, we learn that he had many merchant friends, and who also aspired to have their sons ordained priests. It seems that at least on the level of stereotypes, merchants were expected to have the same kind of cultural cultivation as members of the clergy, and that they wished to be remembered not only as rich and pious, but also as well-educated, erudite men. For example, in an elegy written for his brother Jacob, who died young in 1601, Stephanos painted an idealized portrait of a well-cultivated young priest, likening him to Aristotle and Plato, as well as to scholar giants of early Armenian Christianity, Sahak the Parthian, Mesrop Mashtots, Moses the Grammarian. A few years later, Stephanos recycled the same verses for another elegy, and this time for a merchant friend, making only very few adjustments. Furthermore, it seems that not only were members of clergy and merchants well connected by ties of friendship and kinship, but they were also people who practiced both trades at once. For Stephanos himself, from the notes he left, it is not clear to what extent he personally was involved in the silk business after he became a priest, and how exactly he multiplied the money he made from the silk brought from Tokat. But it seems very likely that it was his connections to the circles of merchant elites, both in Tokat and in Kaffa, that made his migration experience so apparently seamless. Having painted a portrait of the early modern scribe, independent tradesman, urban, mobile, and well-connected, I now turn in the remaining part of my talk to his manuscripts. I asked what kinds of books these artisans produced, for whom, how much they were worth, and what it meant to be a scribe at the moment of mass displacement and the rebuilding of Armenian communities. As noted earlier, 16 manuscripts, I'm not going to go through all 16, are known to have been copied and repaired by Stephanos, including prepared Bible and several liturgical books, poetry collections, and a compendium of glossaries and other miscellaneous. And I will focus now on several broad categories among these books in order to illustrate the social roles manuscripts played in the reconstruction of Armenian communal life. Start. The obvious and first and foremost, manuscripts were liturgical objects. Constant demand for regular operation of churches, and especially for the establishment of new communities. It is therefore not surprising that the majority of manuscripts produced by Stephanos were liturgical books intended for use in his own churches. Celebration of the divine liturgy, the daily cycles of prayers, the administration of sacraments all presuppose the physical presence of specific service books, gospels, lectionaries, synaxaria, hymnals, and others, without which rites could not be properly performed. Beyond their basic textual utility, manuscripts functioned as performing participants within the liturgy itself, not only read out loud, but also carried in procession, elevated, placed on the altar, kissed, and displayed to congregation. Manuscripts also played a crucial role in transmitting ritual norms. Ritual manuals stabilized prayers, liturgical sequences, and calendrical observances, allowing Armenian communities, both in diaspora and in repopulated homelands, to revive familiar forms of worship and re-anchor collective religious life after ruptures. Yet some liturgical manuscripts probably carried additional layers of meaning beyond their sacred function and practical utility, and they were valued for their age and history. Among Stephanos' books was a Bible, originally copied some 3 centuries earlier, probably in Cilicia, which later came into his care in Tokat, and which he repaired. The manuscript would have been treasured not only for its continued liturgical use, but also as a tangible link to the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, a cherished memory of medieval grandeur and of lost sovereignty. When Stephanos fled Tokat from Crimea, this ancient Bible was among the few books he carried with him alongside another repaired manuscript, a 14th century copy of the Armenian translation of Michael the Syrian's Chronicle. Armenian colophons frequently personify manuscripts, narrating their abduction, enslavement, suffering, and miraculous ransom. At the moment when thousands of Armenians were had themselves become refugees and survivors of violence, such narratives probably acquired particular resonance. Manuscripts that had endured displacement and damage could be viewed as survivor objects, mirroring the experiences of communities that preserved them. And I must note here that I borrow this term survivor objects also from Hegnar Wottenbo's work that I mentioned earlier. Now, to repair, preserve, and carry these books was thus to affirm continuity in the face of rupture. Beyond liturgical books, Stepanos also copied a different category of manuscripts central to Armenian communal life. Qarans, or compilations of poetry or songs, lyrical, historical, panegyrical, or sometimes humorous and satirical. Originally, collections of religious songs, Qarans acquired an increasingly secular character from the 16th century onward, and scholars have observed a remarkable proliferation of such manuscripts in this period. These books seem to have been the cornerstone of the majlis, the informal gatherings where elite men, and perhaps sometimes women too, met to discuss communal matters, play music, recite poetry, share food and drink. Most Qarans were small pocket books, usually no larger than 10 by 15 centimeters, designed to be carried easily. Notably, no two Qarans seem to have been identical in manuscript form. Each preserved a unique blend of canonical poems and contemporary living tradition, reflecting ongoing practices of collection and curation. When thousands of Armenians were displaced by the Ottoman Safavid wars and the Jilali attacks, notables could not bring their salons and their pavilions with them, but they could transport their Qarans. But scribes, like Stepanos, probably served as mobile repositories of prized poetic repertoires, transforming oral tradition into tangible, portable objects that helped sustain and reconstitute communal bonds in new environments. Now, I must note that the image on the slide is anachronistic. It's a painting from an 18th century song collection. It's also called the Tagaran, but it is the collection of poems of 18th century Tiflis Armenian Ashuk or Ashek, Nagash Natan. But given that Stepanos mentioned his family's pavilions in Tokat, I was very tempted to include this image. But now I'd like to turn to one final type of manuscript produced by Stepanos, which raises questions about educational practices within Armenian communities and status. Recall his panegyrics and elegies, in which Stepanos frequently praised patrons and friends as learned men, drawing comparisons to great ancient scholars. Were they simply rhetorical devices, or did they reflect something about intellectual life in these communities? In 1598, and back in Tokat, Stepanos copied an intriguing miscellany for a priest named Phobos in the village of Mukhat, about 50 kilometers east of Tokat. Unlike liturgical books meant for congregational use, this manuscript appears to have been intended for private study. It consisted of several specialized glossaries, like a list of rare Middle Armenian or medieval Armenian words for composing verse, Hebrew proper names from scripture, terms from the philosopher Philo of Alexandria, Greek and Arabic pharmaceutical terms called words of Galen the physician, grammatical terms, the so-called words of Persian masters or Middle Persian Zoroastrian terminology encountered in the 5th century Armenian historian Regeshem and others. This tradition, glossary compilations, dated back to at least the 11th century and possibly much earlier, and remained widespread in Armenian manuscript culture throughout the Middle Ages, reflecting both real educational practices or perhaps just a tradition. A small village outside of Tokat, truly a center of learning, where in the late 16th century, students read ancient histories and needed glossaries to access terminology of Philo and Galen. I find it very difficult to believe, though it's not impossible. Or might this manuscript have functioned differently not as a practical learning aid, but as a symbol, but as a symbolic object, embodiment of aspirational status. One wonders whether such manuscripts were commissioned less for their utility than as tokens of belonging to an intellectual tradition. Even if neither Stepanos nor Bogos fully understood all the contents, possessing such a manuscript could perform authority and assert connection to learned heritage in places where practically such learning was no longer possible. Now, beyond serving as markers of learning and status through possession, manuscripts could fulfill another important social function. They could be donated to churches by the elites in acts of public piety. Such donations had multiple meanings. The donor's name, along with their family members, would be recorded in the book, and prayers for them would be requested from all who read, copied, and used it in the centuries to come. The donation was also a political gesture, strengthening the donor's position within the community and affirming their relationship with the clergy. Tradition of performative piety through donations was deeply rooted in Armenian communities. Most prestigious acts were sponsoring church construction or repairs or establishing endowments, which in the earlier periods would entail donating land, revenue-producing properties. In places like Kaffa and Tokat, where Armenian notables derived wealth from trade rather than land ownership, and where building new churches would often be prescribed, donating manuscripts became a much more accessible, yet still significant form of public piety, and a whole economy of piety developed around these books. The colophon of the manuscript I'm showing on the slide of a Haismavurk, or a liturgical compilation of saints' lives, Stepanos copied in Kaffa in 1610, illustrates how this worked in practice. This was the largest manuscript he ever copied, 650 folios, measuring 43 by 29 centimeters. The manuscript was originally commissioned by a priest of a different church, but the commission fell through. It was then sponsored by a merchant named Hoja Abraham of Gurjuk and his wife Sarah, notables of Kaffa's Armenian community, probably of Anatolian origin, who donated it to Stepanos' own church as an indelible memorial gift. The manuscript itself bears witness to this change of patronage. Stepanos had to squeeze the new patrons' names into every space throughout the book where the original commissioner's family had been mentioned. So in exchange for their donations, the book would carry prayers for the whole extended family of Abraham, his grandfather, father, brother, his son and grandchildren, mother, wife, in-laws, and all of their kinsmen. The image of the merchant that I'm showing on the slide is also anachronistic, and it's a portrait of an Armenian merchant in Madras in the 18th century, but I've included it here because it was a portrait commissioned by the merchant himself, who wanted to be portrayed with the book. Now, finally, before I conclude, I would like to say just a few words about the value of the manuscript. Manuscript making a profitable trade. In general, as far as I know, it is not very common for colophons to mention the price of commission, although not that uncommon either. But in the case of the Haismavurk mentioned in the previous slide, Stepanos left us another jewel. Not only does he mention the price of the manuscript, but also gives us the idea of the sum's relative worth. So the story goes like this. Before its eventual sponsor, the manuscript was commissioned for another church by a priest, but the commissioner pulled out midway because he received another manuscript as a gift. Stepanos then decided to donate it as a pious act himself, in memory of his own family. Then suddenly his wife intervened, saying that she wanted to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem with their son. An argument ensued, and Stepanos reports this directly in the colophon, but eventually he conceded to his wife's wishes. He found a patron in Hoja Abraham, who purchased the manuscript for 50 gold coins. Stepanos gave 30 of those coins to his wife and son for their pilgrimage. This provides a rare and concrete reference point. The manuscript price was nearly twice the cost of sending two people on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, clearly a very expensive undertaking in the 17th century. True that this was a particularly large and costly manuscript, but it illustrates that with a steady flow of commissions, manuscript making could be a fairly profitable trade as well. Let me conclude by returning to the question that opened this talk. How did Armenian manuscript production flourish amidst profound crisis? How did it survive and even accelerate when monastic scriptoria were in decline and Armenian communities were scattered across vast distances, rebuilding their lives as refugees in new environments? The story of Stepanos may offer one potential answer. Manuscripts played a crucial role in rebuilding Armenian communities, both in diaspora and in ravaged homelands. They served multiple overlapping functions as liturgical objects, essential for worship, as embodiments of shared history and memory, as portable tokens of sociability, as instruments of learning and status symbols. Through pious donations, they also allowed elites to perform traditional roles of patronage and public devotion. Across all these functions, manuscripts help reconstitute the myriad inherited social practices disrupted by physical destruction, displacement, and migration. But what made this possible was a particular kind of manuscript production, one that could meet the urgent demand of newly founded churches and new congregations. Whereas great monastic scriptoria, with their institutional continuity and concentrated resources, produced artistic masterpieces, independent scribes like Stepanos produced something no less important: resilience. Working independently and supported by emergent patrons, they created a decentralized system of cultural production that did not depend on institutions. They could start with minimal resources, they could move, rebuild, and continue their work wherever Armenian communities were being rebuilt. In telling the story of Stepanos, I've tried to pay tribute to figures who remain largely invisible to history. Rarely do more than a few manuscripts survive attached to any one scribe's name. We cannot speak of their schools, styles, as we do with great scriptoria. These were unassuming individuals working for pious reward for money and for recognition within their communities. Yet they performed a vital service. They sustained Armenian manuscript tradition through one of its most turbulent periods. Thank you.